Okay, hi everyone. So today we are very grateful to have Mehdi Azabo to present his work with us here. He is a PhD candidate at Georgia Tech in the Eva Dyer lab. And just a quick reminder that this, feel free to interrupt with questions. We are recording the talk, which we'll share afterward. And yeah, go ahead. Take it away, Mehdi.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you, Paul, and thank you everyone for being here. So today I'm excited to present our recent work that was presented at NeurIPS last year, which is called a unified scalable framework for neuropopulation decoding. So before I jump into explaining what the work is about, I kind of want to frame it in the context of kind of what is happening currently in foundation models for foundation models in general. Okay. Before I start, I would first of all want to acknowledge all the team that contributed to this work, my advisor Eva Dyer, and everyone from both Georgia Tech as well as Mila. So as we all are familiar with, there has been a huge trend in past years of using foundation models in different domains. This has been critical, for example, in language models for unlocking different applications that aren't possible before, and vision models as well, where we can align text with images, generate images, do segmentation, segment anything, all these different applications that were really unlocked with scale. And we've also observed this in other domains, like in graphs and audio as well. So it seems like over the years, the lessons that we keep learning again and again is that data is really important, and scale is the kind of the more recent lesson, which is like both model size and amount of data that we're training with is really important. And so the questions that you might ask here is that how can we leverage this in neuroscience? And why would it be important? So I think there are a couple of arguments that you can make about why neuro foundation models could be interesting. First of all, we've seen these kind of in language models, these emerging capabilities that only are unlocked only with scale. And so we also ask the question of whether there are certain things that we can maybe model from the brain or decode from the brain that could only happen when we reach a certain scale of model size and data. But also, this new approach of creating large models that you can then fine-tune is actually fits very well with the types of applications that we're looking for in neuroscience, especially with that because we want to develop tools for neuroscientists to be able to. So you're not looking to develop methods for experts, machine learning experts to be applied to neuroscience, but we want to have maybe pre-trained model that people can easily and accessibly fine-tune on their own data and be able to run different applications. And so next question is, would it be possible to train a neuroscience foundation model? And I think the answer is yes. Over the years, we've seen this increased amount of data that is being recorded. We're recording more and more neurons simultaneously in the brain, and there is a larger and larger collection of neural data sets across different species, across different brain regions, and so the data is there. Now, the challenge, which is kind of more complicated than in other domains, is that the data sets are very heterogeneous. So we're talking about multiple modalities, we're talking about multiple brain regions, multiple tasks. And so that's what also makes it challenging to find this unified view of neural data. And then finally, I want to also make the point about how we actually might need neuroscience foundation models. So this is not just trying to take foundation models and applying to neuroscience, but I think in neuroscience, we have this critical challenge, which is that currently brain models are being trained on a single data set. So these models are trained on a single individual, and even sometimes on one day recording of that individual. And so we're kind of breaking the main rule of deep learning, which is we need a lot of data, but yet we're training our models on very small data sets. And so this, I think, could be a huge limit in how much we can be leveraging and using machine learning and deep learning in this domain. And so the idea would be, or the core challenge that we want to address is to create some sort of universal model that can take in any number of data sets and can be trained on multiple different downstream tasks. And so our work that we presented there is kind of trying to move towards this objective. Specifically, we were interested in the application of brain decoding. So we wanted to basically take brain activity from different monkeys and be able to decode hand velocity. So this is electrophysiological activity, and the goal was to create a single model that would be trained on multiple data sets at the same time. So first of all, we want to see what this data looks like and what are the challenges of current approaches. So electrophysiology recordings is also known as spiking neural activity. So we record from the brain, we get a set of neurons, and those neurons are going to have different spike trains. So it's a multivariate irregular time series. And typically the approach to be able to process this type of data is to regularize it so we can fit it into the typical machine learning and deep learning architecture. So whether we talk about a linear regression or a transformer model, the approach has always been to put this format the input in this 2D matrix where we have neuron by time. And as I will argue shortly, this is what makes it hard to generalize or create this unified model. Both dimensions have challenges when it comes to or like the way we represent the data. So first, let's talk about the neural dimension. So usually every time we record from the brain, we're going to get a new set of neurons. So let's say we have a model that we train on one data set. This data set is going to have n different neurons. And so the model is going to know that channel number 1 will always correspond to neuron number 1. Channel number 2 will be neuron number 2, etc. Now, the challenge is when we have a new data set. So even if we recorded a new animal or even a new day, we're going to have a new set of neurons, which we don't know the identity for. So the question becomes, how do we align this population of neuron with the existing one that our model was trained on? More importantly, does that alignment even exist? Maybe we're just like, each time we're taking a random slice of the brain, and so we wouldn't be able to even make that alignment possible. And so this is kind of the critical challenge when we look at being able to train a model on a variable number of neurons and neurons for which we don't know the identity. And so this is what typically, when we look at multiple data sets, as I said, we're going to have variable amounts of data, 30 neurons or 200 neurons, maybe 1,000 neurons, but we wouldn't be able to all feed them to the same like sequential model. So the idea we come up with is to introduce this concept of unit embeddings. As some of you might be familiar with, word embeddings. So usually we have a vocabulary of words and we'd want to map a word into some sort of d-dimensional embedding space. So in that case, the language model is encouraged to learn the relationship between the words as well as the semantic meaning of those words. And so it's going to organize the words that it finds in the vocabulary in a way that is meaningful to accomplish the next token prediction task. And so in our case, we're also saying that because we don't know the identity of this neuron, it should be some sort of latent learnable embedding. So each neuron that we encounter during training, we're going to map to a learnable d-dimensional space in which we would want the model to capture maybe the latent properties of that neuron. Maybe its functional tuning curve or its cell type or the different properties of what makes that neuron fire that way. And so this way we can also capture the relationship between the neurons across both the population and across multiple data sets. So potentially two neurons that are close in this embedding space would have similar functionality, if you will. And so by doing this, we can now create a model where we can associate each spike train with this learnable unit embedding. And more critically, we can have a variable number. The order of these neurons or these channels no longer matters. So if you have n channels, if you have two n channels, we can just still feed them into the same kind of model. This is why our model is called POYO, which stands for pre-train on many neurons, which also the word that Kirby says, and our idea was to have Kirby, which would inhale all the brain data. That was just a convoluted way of like naming the model. But yeah, so we have our model, which can be permutation invariant and can take in any number of neurons, and that's how we can possibly train a unified or universal brain model. The second dimension is the time dimension. So typically in the spiking neural activity, because it's so sparse, we usually have to do some sort of binning. So we create bins of a certain bin size and we count the number of spikes. Yes, question?
Yeah. Sorry, could you just about the previous slide, could you
Yes.
talk a little bit more about how the map from neuron to embedding is done? Like, is it usually, I understand it's in language, right? It's a dictionary. You associate each word with. So, like, how do you map here? Do you just keep a random like dictionary for every neuron, and then you adjust those embeddings as you train, or yeah?
Exactly. So it's a
Okay.
lookup table. It's an infinite lookup table, and if we observe new neurons, we add them to the lookup table, randomly initialize them, and then try to train them along with the model. Yeah.
I
And
see.
I'll explain later on.
Okay.
So during training, we'll have, let's
Okay.
say we have 20,000 neurons in the training set. We'll have 20,000 look like a 20,000 dimensional lookup table. And then I'll explain later as well how we could feed in a new set of neurons as well. But in
Okay.
this case, each neuron will have its own learnable unit embedding. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you for the question. So yeah, so back to the time dimension. So as I said, the typical approach is to bin data or count the number of spikes in a small window, and then represent the data that way. Again, the goal was always to regularize the input so that we can feed it into these conventional like RNNs and LSTMs, etc. But the challenge here is that if we use bins that are too large, as you can see here, we're going to lose a lot of the temporal resolution that is present in the data. At the same time, if we can increase or like decrease the bin size, we're going to start having more accurate timing information, but we're going to create this huge matrix that has a lot of sparsity. And when I tested this initially, I was surprised to see that even in the motor cortex, which is one of the areas where there's a lot of firing, if we use a 5 millisecond bin size, 99% of that huge matrix will be composed of zeros. So we're basically feeding into our model a bunch of like, we're not treating the data as it is, which is it's a sparse representation, and we should treat it as is. And the reason why this is important is because we're also wanting to create models that are also scalable. So this is also another area where we wanted to make sure that we're able to make, or as we're like challenging what the representation should be, we thought that this representation of the time should be also taken into account. And so the way we solve this problem is, and I'll introduce quickly what tokenization is, but is introducing this idea of spike tokenization. So in language, tokenization is this idea of decomposing a sentence into small elements, which are usually the vocabulary. And then each of those elements are going to give us the sequence of, again, d-dimensional embeddings that we can then feed to our language model. But for us, the way we tokenize the spikes is by saying every single spike that we're going to encounter in the recording is going to correspond to a token. This token has two pieces of information. One, the unit embedding, so the learnable unit embedding from which the spike came, as well as the timing or the timestamp of that unit. And so this way, we're just representing the spikes, the sequence of spikes. And so here I have an illustration of how this works. So each time we observe a spike, we just represent it as a token. Again, units and time, and we're basically having this sparse representation of our spiking activity. Okay, so at the end we have a sequence of spikes. The sequence of the spikes, the context size we're going to fix by time. So we're going to say we have 1 second of recording, which means that depending on how many neurons we'll have in this window and what the average firing rate of those neurons, we're going to have a variable number of tokens. So the tokens, just as a frame of reference, we're going to have anywhere in our data sets, we had anywhere between 2,000 and 30,000 tokens.
Can I ask?
Yes.
So every token corresponds to a different unit, right?
So tokens from the same unit will have the same unit embedding. The only thing that is different between them is the timestamp.
Okay.
But
And
they have,
then,
yeah.
so how do you define the time step? Like, what is that? The proportion of the way through the 1 second?
That's a good question. So we ended up using a rotary position embeddings. So we just want to encode the position time embedding, I guess, and we use rotary position embedding to, instead of, okay, technically we could just use absolute position embedding. So we use sinusoidal embeddings to encode the time in that 1 second window, and added as like both the unit embedding and that absolute time embedding. But then what we do in practice is that we use the rotary position embeddings, which allow us to encode the relative position, which is more powerful than just using absolute. Yeah. Does that answer your question, or?
So, yeah. So if you say have 2 seconds of data, your sample at the start of the first second has the same time embedding as at 0, or no? How does that work?
So it should no, it should have a different embedding. So it should have the embedding for so if our context window is 1 second, we're always going to slice our data to be between 0 and 1. And so that's how we represent it. But if this context window is higher, we'll just encode that higher timestamp. So between 0 and 2, then we'll have a scale or like an embedding that will encode all the timestamps between 0 and 2 seconds. Because these are not learnable time embeddings, they are just sinusoidal time embeddings, so we can just generalize them to a larger context.
I thought you said every sample. So you're dividing into 1 second samples of activity,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So then but they're not are they being processed like independently? Every sample is 1 second?
Yes, in this case, yes, yeah. So it's
Yeah.
1 second at a time. Yeah, exactly.
So then there's no information of like, if you have 10 seconds of recording,
Yeah.
like there is going to be information shared between the samples at like 1.2 seconds and 1.8 seconds, but not between 0.8 seconds and 1.2 seconds.
Exactly, yeah. We don't though, so they are kind of processed in isolation. Once we have that 1 second chunk, everything is reset to be between 0 and 1. It's not like if we take slice between 4 and 5, it will be now between 0 and 1 in the eyes of the model, I guess. So we don't
Okay.
take that timing into account. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, thank you.
You're welcome. So we have our context window, 1 second, as you can see here. We get our sequence of spikes, and then as a reminder, our goal was to predict hand velocity. So this is where we also find another challenge, which is that because we want to train on multiple data sets from different labs, each lab will have its own experimental protocol, and we might have kind of different sampling rates and the velocity as well. And so the way we frame this problem is that we want to go from an input sequence, which I just explained has a variable length, to an output sequence, which also has another variable length. So we cannot just apply a transformer model because the lengths of the sequences do not necessarily match, and it's like dynamic. So what we end up adopting is the perceiver IO architecture, which allows us to map any sequence to any other sequence, and also happens to be computationally efficient by basically going from the input space to a latent space where most of the transformer operations are done, and then back to this output space that we want to get. So this is kind of a walkthrough of the architecture. So the first
Can
thing,
I interrupt? Another question,
yes,
sorry. Still about
yes,
the tokenization.
uh-huh,
And this question relates to the comment in the chat from Vatsala. So the embedding is at a unit-wise plus the time step. So like a given spike, you have the identifier for what unit it came from, plus where it was in the time of the 0 to 1 seconds. And that is used to give you the embedding that then gets through to like the subsequent steps. So every unit,
mhm.
you have to have a completely different embedding for every unit. So I guess you haven't gotten to this of like when you're, or have you, like if you have a new data set, every single
Yes,
unit is starting from scratch. Like
exactly,
you're not
yes,
using with LLMs, you're having like a vocabulary that's shared across
Ex
everything.
yeah,
But here you have to start the vocabulary from scratch, right?
exactly, correct, yeah. So in this case, we're saying that we don't know the identity of the neuron that we're working with or unit that we're working with, and so we'll have to restart from scratch every single time. And I'll explain later on how we actually do this. It's not as complicated as it sounds, but basically, yes, that what you said is correct. Every single unit that we encounter during training would have a learnable embedding. So if we have 20,000 units across all data sets, we'll have 20,000 unique unit embeddings. And if you have new data sets, we have to initialize them randomly and relearn them basically. Yeah,
Okay.
correct.
But then, sorry, like
Yes.
elaborating on this point, you presumably want to use this model to predict some test held out data set, right? That it has never seen before during training. So how would this model do that if it has never seen those neurons in the test set?
Yes, so currently in the current setup that we had, we adopted like the common benchmarks that people were using, which is still test set within the same session. So we have a few samples of training data, and then we test on the same day. So you'd have already observed those neurons. Now, what you're mentioning is doing kind of zero shot kind of prediction in a new complete, like a new subject maybe on a new day, and that's something we haven't done yet. But what I will show later on, or what we were able to demonstrate, is that it is possible to do very few shot fine tuning on when you have a new data set. So you will still need a few samples to do this on a new data set, but it still works pretty well. And obviously all your points are valid. The idea is to move to a place where we don't even need any samples to like get these unit embeddings and somehow infer them just from the activity of the neurons, or by doing some self-supervised learning, or even like, yeah, straight up like zero shot inference.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. And so just to contextualize it as well, we only have 1 second of data that the model is looking at. And so it's hard if you present a model with 1 second of data for it to determine what the unit role is, and like it might not have seen it for a longer context. So it's actually challenging to just feed in 1 second and expect it to just generalize without any further context that it sees. But yeah, hopefully I'll convince you at the end that this idea of unit embeddings at least makes sense, and that it is still possible to work within that framework, at least the idea of fine-tuning on new data sets and like having some sort of generalization across labs, I guess. Yeah. Cool. And I'm happy to continue chatting about this when we get to the point. Maybe it will make more sense. So just quickly going over the architecture. So yeah, as I was explaining, we have the spikes. We get our spike tokens, and then perceiver IO. The idea is that we have learnable latent embedding. So this is going to be a fixed number of latents that we use cross attention to query the spike tokens, and then basically this is a compression operation. So we're going to try to compress all those inputs, which are like a variable length, into this fixed number of latent, learnable latent tokens. And so once we do that, we can do our transformer basically in the latent space. We apply multiple self-attention layers in the latent space on these latent tokens to process anything about the population activity. And then finally, we want to go back to the output space. So it's the opposite operation. We're using cross-attention to query the latent space about what is the behavior at different timestamps. So again, here we go back to this idea that I mentioned earlier, which is that across different data sets, we're going to have a variable number of, or variable sampling rate. So in 1 second, we might have 1,000 Vx, Vy vectors, and in other data sets, might only have 100. And so in order to create a foundation model, or like moving towards this universal model, we need to take into account this variability. And so the way we do this is that we're going to also present each value in that velocity as a single token. And so this value is going to be encoded with two things. It's kind of the symmetric idea of the unit embeddings, but basically it's the session embedding. So the session embedding is there to be able to capture any latent experimental conditions. So what we observe is that depending on like these data sets that we're working with, some people are using like a kind of a manipulandum, some including like a touch screen. And so there is like a variable, different types of controllers. And with these controllers, we have different types of dynamics, different types of sensitivities, etc. So the way we're registering that velocity can be very different. And so we use this session embedding to learn that latent experimental condition to be able to project into the right space of the behavior. So we're kind of also trying to align the behavior across different data sets. And so we have the session embedding as well as the timestamp. And so we can ask, what is the velocity at this specific timestamp? And then the model will output us the answer for it, and we can use mean squared error loss to train the model. So more in practice, the points in the outputs don't have to be regularly sampled, but the idea is that given query times that are laid out like this, we'll get the answers at this given, or like requested or queried timestamps. And so this way we can train the model with both spikes and outputs from across many different data sets without having to worry about this heterogeneity that comes from them. Make sense so far?
It makes sense. How do
Okay.
you define session?
So it's again a learnable learnable session embedding. So each session you encounter
No,
is a
I mean
yeah,
like practically speaking, is a session every time they start a new recording? Like, is it
yeah,
every day or?
every day, yeah.
Okay. So, but the like it's still the same units though. They don't, maybe they move a little bit from day to day or something, but
So across days they will move for sure. And in a lot of our data sets we don't have like day one and day two and day three. It's more like day one and then day seven and then day 54. So it's very variable. And so we make the assumption that for one recording you have a unique set of units and a unique session ID. And then we change that every day to relearn anything.
oh, so the
We,
units, even if it is technically the same unit, you're assuming it's like a different unit on a separate day because that it's going to move around.
Exactly, yeah. So because we don't know how it will move around, we just make the assumption that, okay, let's relearn it from scratch. But we have done since then experiments to try to leverage that information that we already maybe seen most of these units in a previous day. So how can we like simplify this unit identification problem again on the new day? And that does seem to be working pretty well. And also regarding the session embedding, we also tried like fixing the session embedding to be the session embedding from the first day because the hope is that it will just capture the equipment's like latent, like just something that is inherent to the equipment and not to the animal, or like something that will be dynamic over time. And that also seems to be working pretty well. So what we also find is that because these session embeddings do not like um, we're just making it learnable. We're not letting the model predict, or like we're not letting the model know that this is the same animal and these days are like 2 days apart or something like that. We actually find that the model ends up converging to, I think I have it, a plot of this. So we do find that for the same animal, the session embeddings end up clustering together. And for the same animals from the same lab, they're also very close to each other, which is also a good sign. So this is all done without any supervision, and that's a good sign to indicate that the session embedding is actually capturing what we hoped it would capture.
Right.
Yeah,
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 because otherwise like you just have this big vocabulary. You don't
right.
know, the model wouldn't know without this that these units are actually belonging to the same animal, the same scanning day.
Exactly, yeah. But also what is really cool is that we can feed in a different session embedding, right? We can take this animal C and feed it the embedding of animal I. What will happen is that we'll get good predictions. They're just in the style of the other equipment and not the equipment from that lab. It's like really interesting to see. But basically it's kind of dictating how we're just going to maybe rotate that velocity or like scale it in a way that works for that lab.
Hmm.
Right.
Interesting. Thanks.
Welcome. Yeah. Okay, so back to this. Okay, cool. So before we jump into scaling, we just were like, okay, let's try our model on a single data set, right? Like see how that performs. And what we were surprised about was to find that even though we're using like this transformer architecture, which have historically been bad for neural data, at least for spiking neural data, as you can see in these three different models, we're able to show that this model performs really well and surprisingly is not super sensitive to hyperparameters, which is also a key thing that we want to strive for when you're developing these tools, is having tools that are easy to tune and stuff. And across all of our paper, we were able to use the same exact hyperparameters for all 150 datasets coming from different sources and having different sources of noise, which is also a good sign. That this model is kind of stable. Okay, so let's talk about scaling, which I think is the really cool part. So what we did was curate about 150 datasets. And when I say datasets here mean a session, so it's a unique 30 minutes to 3 hour recording from a given animal. So here we have 9 different monkeys from 3 different labs. And these monkeys are performing various behavioral tasks. So all of them include some sort of moving a cursor, but basically there's a center outreach, which is very discrete. You have 8 different directions that you want to move towards, a random target on this grid, a random target with another type of controller which has like shows the random targets on the screen and the animal has to move towards them. And then finally a maze task where the animal has to reach a target while avoiding certain obstacles. Note here that this dataset, which is the one that I presented the results for, we held out for testing, so we don't train our large model on this dataset. The other thing is that, so most of these datasets come from motor cortex. All of them have motor cortex, and some of them will also have premotor cortex or somatosensory cortex. The total number of units is 27,000. And just to, so what we made sure to do was to not try to process the data ourselves. So we didn't attempt to standardize the data. We just took it as it was. Whatever the labs that released the data, whatever processing they had done to clean it up or not clean it up or do threshold crossings or spike sorting, which are two different techniques to be able to process data. So here, even when you say unit, it could be one neuron or it could be multiple neurons. So we just take the data in its rawest, not the rawest form, but I guess without having to worry about processing ourselves, because you want to have this general model that will work across different conditions. Okay, so this is the results that we wanted to, I guess the cool result about this thing is that we find that we are able, first of all, to train a single model on 150 datasets, which is really cool. But also, we find that surpasses the performance of a single session model, which is nice. But I think the takeaway for me that is important is that, first of all, this model, this multi-dataset model that we're seeing, the blue bar is actually one model across all these 4 figures, whereas the gray is like 150 different single session models. And so what we were after was having a model that could unify across different datasets, but we're finding that also gets us benefits in decoding performance, these different tasks. And just for reference, the decoding accuracy here is R squared between the ground truth velocity and the predicted velocity. Any questions so far? Cool. So let's talk about scaling. So we attempted to do our mini version of the scaling, seeing how the performance of the model improves with both number of parameters and amount of data. So here I'm setting, so we have our smallest model, we compare the equivalent single session model versus the multi-session model. So we can see that having more data, even at this number of parameters, helps a lot. And then when we increase the number of parameters, we see this continuous improvement in performance, which is a good sign. What we also find in terms of amount of data that is trained, the model is trained with, so here we have our smallest model in black. So when we only train on one session and then add all the random target data sets, we see an improvement. So all these, the performance here is reported for all the random target tasks. So we have, I think, about 30 of these data sets. So we're getting the average performance of this model on the random target tasks. So if we train on all of them together, we get a good decoding performance. But now if we add the center out task, which has nothing to do with the random target and could be a more simple version of the task, it does seem to help. So it doesn't hurt the performance, decoding performance on this other task, which is something else we worried about. It's not just the heterogeneity of the data itself, but also of the tasks that we were working with. But here we found that it does actually help. And of course, because we're adding so much data, adding more parameters continue getting us linear improvement in the performance of the model. Cool.
Question.
Yes.
This is all really amazing results for the model trainings on these different tasks. So this is not self-supervised. This is for every data set, you know what the task is, and you're training the full thing end to end, predicting the eventual task output for every single data set sample, depending on what the sample was, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. We're from that data set, we're holding out samples for testing as well. So we don't train on when I'm reporting the accuracy, I'm not recording the training accuracy, but samples that were held out at the end of this session, at the end of each session for testing. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a question here about the results, or maybe just more about your conclusion when you saw the results. Were you more impressed by the results? Were you expecting to have much more improvement once you added all this data set? Because if I see correctly, the model is already doing very well on a single session, probably with a lot of parameters, and then the gain maybe is not a lot when you added all these parameters and all these model.
Yes. Yeah. No, so this the reason why we selected this type of data sets is because we knew that we already are able to decode in this regime, and our goal was to basically show that we can create a single model on these data, like on all these data sets, because that's something that wasn't done before, and so we weren't even sure that this would be possible, and we found that there is like this advantage in improving the decoding performance as we scale the number of parameters, the number of data sets. But I think we'll see an even stronger improvement in maybe tasks that have been shown to not be decodable when you just train on a single data set. I think that's where we see the biggest improvement, because hand velocity decoding has been shown to be kind of decodable, and we're improving things slightly, but I think our goal was to demonstrate that this single model that we can train on multiple data sets is possible. And the advantages that we would hope, at least signs of scaling, that it continues improving as we add more data or as we increase the number of parameters. We have signs that is somehow happening, but also, as I explain later, the fine-tuning aspect of it as well, that we can use this pre-trained model and only use like 4 or 5 trials of 1 second and still get better performance than if we trained an MLP or GRU or any other advanced model on these types of data sets. And so that's kind of I would say the takeaway from from our results for sure.
Cool, thanks.
Okay. Cool. So maybe it's a good time to talk about the fine-tuning aspect of this. So again, our goal is to show that maybe it's possible by having this large pre-training of a model to enable fast, efficient, and few-shot fine-tuning, right? And so this is where we go back to this idea of unit embeddings, as we discussed earlier. If we have a new unit, how can we add it into our vocabulary, basically? And so the analogy I like to make, which is similar to language, is if we just had an English vocabulary and now we have a new French word for dog, and we want to add it to the existing vocabulary. So ideally, we'd be able to map this word next to its English equivalent in some sense, to be able to have the model interpret it without having to relearn a lot of things that has already learned. So similarly, if we have a new unit, we want to be able to map it next to its like similar neurons that are already in the training set. And so what we found to be really powerful, which was surprising, is that we can freeze all of the model. So all the transformer, like self-attention, everything is frozen except for these new units that need to be learned, as well as the new session embedding. So it's kind of like a very, very small number of parameters compared to the number of parameters on the rest of the model. And so what we would need to do is freeze the model, and then add the units embeddings for these new neurons, as well as a new session embedding, and then use gradient descent to update or relearn these unit embeddings. And so here I have kind of an animation that shows this. So initially, these are randomly initialized for the new units, and this is the prediction of the model that you're getting. And interestingly, it's not noisy, but it's kind of 0, which is kind of somehow related to the fact that maybe the model is, or like the random initialization of the units is kind of centered around 0. But we're still investigating why this is happening, but it's really interesting. But so basically, oh, I think the animation is not working. Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, so we start training on a few examples, and we can see that as the model is moving around these unit embeddings for the new units, that our output is being predicted correctly, basically. And so what this is saying is that by just moving this very small number of points, we're able to accomplish a decoding on a new data set. This kind of suggests that the model that we learned in the middle, which is kind of the bulk of our weights, and the model that learns to map the population activity or population activity to the behavior, is kind of generalizable across data sets. And so that's kind of the conclusion that I would make from this, is that because we have new data sets that we didn't see before, we're able to just re-identify the units and get good performance better than if we trained from scratch. Then that's a good sign to say that the model is somehow learning something, like it's learning something generalizable across these data sets. So just to show you more concrete results, so we trained our model on a subset of the data sets and then only tested it on a new animal from a new lab performing a new task. So there's the model hasn't even seen this specific behavioral task, hasn't seen any data from that lab, and hasn't seen that animal. So in that sense, we're testing whether someone who has collected new data can use this pre-trained model that they can take off the shelf and fine-tune it on their data and how well that model will perform. And so what we find is that, what we find is that the model performs, this is the unit ID stands for unit identification. So the example where we freeze all the model weights and only train the unit embeddings and the session embedding. And the fine-tuned is when we let the model fine-tune the full weights. Yeah. So in pink, we're seeing the single session model, which we've already established kind of performs better than a bunch of different baselines from the GRU to like more advanced transform models. But then when you do unit identification, we're getting even better performance at a lower cost and by only tuning a few parameters. And also, so we kind of show that it's possible to fine-tune a small number of parameters and that it is efficient, but also we show that the number of samples or the number of trials we actually need to fine-tune the model is pretty low. So we need less data to fine-tune the model to reach the performance, the best performance that you can get on the data set. But also we're getting it's very compute efficient because we converge very quickly when you do unit identification, a very small number of steps. And actually, we were able to run our biggest model on basically do fine-tuning on CPU, which because there's the number of parameters is so small and the number of samples that are needed to train is so small that we can do this fine-tuning process in basically a few minutes. Any questions?
Very impressive. So the fine-tuning works better than the unit identification, but the unit identification is super easy to compute. Are you saying that like assuming that you had a lot of compute, does it make would you always do fine-tuning, or like does it depend on the number of samples you have?
That's a really cool question, I think. I would say it depends on the scenario that you're in. So let me walk you through the scenario where, for example, we have a lab that is collecting data, like they just started collecting data, and they're collecting data across multiple animals, across multiple days, right? They got a chunk of data, they trained this model on that data, but then they want to add a new animal without having to create a new fork or like a new variant of the model. By doing unit identification, you're just adding new units in that lookup table without messing with the model parameters. And so that model could still be used for the old data and the new data as well, right? And so that has the advantage of creating one model and continuously updating it for new data without having to retrain or change like its weights, right? And so that has that advantage. And we do see that this fine-tuning, I think, is helpful when you have a completely new lab. So there's like small subtleties in the way the data is fed, like small differences, maybe that the model, by fine-tuning it a bit more, it can help improve the decoding performance. But what we see is that if we're trying to fine-tune in a new animal from the same lab, it basically performs equally the same. And so my answer to your question is, I would say that unit identification at a certain scale, if we start training not on 3 labs, but on 6, 7, 10 different labs, potentially we'll start covering more of that distribution and need that fine-tuning a bit less. Yeah.
I see. Okay. And then clarification question for the unit ID. Are you saying that you are creating new units in the vocabulary, or yes, that is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's kind of like we can get rid of the lookup table. Like if we have a new data set, we don't have to keep around the pre-trained units from the old training data sets because a person might not care about them. the idea is you can either extend the lookup table by adding new rows, or delete that lookup table and start a new one with the rows for those new units, but randomly initialized. And then you
How does that
remove them.
relate to the figure you had of like dog cat, and then like it finds its way to the similar point? When you're training the new
Yeah.
units, like how is it using the existing units as like the reference?
That's a really good point. So it's kind of more conceptual. We're not looking at the points themselves. We're looking at what the model is expecting. So the model has in its inputs an expectation of what the input embedding features are looking like, right? And so we're kind of moving the unit embedding into placed in a position that the model can interpret it in the same way it interpreted the word dog here. And so we don't necessarily need to have the existing vocabulary to be able to do this tuning, because it's kind of, you can see that this unit, like the embedding space is kind of this continuous space in which different pockets of the space correspond to different properties of neurons, and we want to converge towards them. But there might be other advanced techniques to be able to leverage the existing vocabulary and like some sort of relationship between the neurons to better do this unit identification. But currently, it doesn't require the existing of like other neurons that are in that space. It doesn't even have to be mapped to exactly an existing neuron. It could be like it's a continuous space. So it can be
Like you could just delete the entire lookup table, and it would still be fine.
exactly, yeah. Yep. But that's why when I'm mentioning the fine tuning is that if you start fine tuning the weights of the model, you might change the kind of the receptive field, if you will, of the model. And now the old units that you had from other data sets will no longer be fed because the model kind of changed its like input, basically, yeah, or receptive field, yeah. Cool. So yeah, so that was kind of the fine tuning piece. And so we're currently, I just want to share some of the other results that we're currently working on to expanding this type of idea in other types of recordings. In this case, this is the Allen datasets where they have different mice being shown different visual stimuli. And so this is a different brain region. So this is the visual cortex and other brain regions as well. And so here we're trying to, and also another probe. So in the previous experiments, it was mostly Utah arrays, and this is NeuroPixel. So it's another type of recording. And we kind of are seeing this similar trends where we're able to decode even better when we have like multiple sessions, and we're able to scale the model to even larger amounts of data and larger amounts of units overall that it sees during training. And also we've shown that, right, look, in the case of velocity, we were able to train on regression tasks. So that's kind of a high resolution type of output. But in this case, we're doing sequence level classification, which is still possible to train with a cursor label in other data sets and contexts.
Was there a reason you picked the visual areas here instead of the motor areas?
Sorry,
Was there a reason you picked the visual areas here rather than the motor areas to decode the decision?
So we just wanted to experiment to see how this type of approach works in other brain regions and other species. So mice and visual area, those are two things that we hadn't done before. So that's why, and plus classification. So we wanted to test the model in a new regime. But our goal necessarily is not to target a specific brain region, but to be able to work on different brain regions. So this is an example. The Allen dataset has a lot of large-scale data. It's one of the biggest repositories of public electrophysiological and like data sets. And so that sounded like a good fit for us to be able to test more of our model in that regime.
Yeah. Very good.
Cool. And so to conclude, hopefully I was able to convince you that this kind of approach for solving this creating of this universal model is like needed, and that it is possible. We're able to show that by designing the right type of tokenization and representing the input in the correct way, we're able to enable this unification across multiple data sets, but also make a tokenization that is efficient in terms of the way we present the temporal resolution. We've shown that the creation of a single model as possible, and then it improves the decoding performance. And then finally, which I think is another big vector of what we're trying to do, this model could potentially be an accessible model for end users and specifically neuroscientists to be able to perform few shot fine-tuning, unit identification if they don't have a lot of compute, or otherwise fine-tuning if they have enough compute, or even training if they want to scale their model. And we've shown that we've consistently found we've done an extensive hyperparameter tuning like analyses to show that it's actually pretty stable for a wide range of hyperparameters, which has been a very critical problem when working with different spiking neural data sets. We're trying to train the models on there, is that they're extremely sensitive to the choice of hyperparameters, which kind of what deters from people from using deep learning in neuroscience, or particularly for like spiking neural data. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is really great work and also presented super clearly. And if
Oh,
people
thank you.
haven't seen your website for the project, like that's even more well presented with like interactive graphics. It's crazy. So like really well done. We have a
Thank you.
question from Connor. He says, related to unit embeddings, do you have any 3D coordinate information for the unit recording sites? Did you try using this info to get better unit embeddings?
Really good point. Yes. So right now we're exploring other modalities, and that's definitely something that is really useful, being able to encode the position. If there are coordinates that are determined, the position of the electrode in the brain, then we can imagine basically adding that information in. And we found in some of our early experiments that does indeed help when we have something about like the position in the brain region, especially if we start working with like multiple regions, if we do know that information, adding it in could help with creating a better unit embedding. So yeah, so that's definitely something that would be helpful. Because by adding that information, you're also allowing the model to do this implicit alignment a bit better, because it knows what the relationship between the different electrodes in the brain are. So yeah. Ideally, we would be able to like encode the structure of the probe or like the recording device itself. So whether we have an array or we have a chunk or like a neuropixels like 1.5D electrode, ideally would be able to encode that stuff. But obviously, a lot of the constraints that we're trying to address as we move towards this idea of a foundation model is to be able to minimize how much work we have to do in terms of like writing actual code to extract like these different types of properties. And that's going to be like a major bottleneck for us to be able to scale on more and more data. So both, as you mentioned, Paul, like the supervision is kind of a limitation we currently have. We wanted to start there to experiment to see how well we can, like, if it's possible, at least to do this unification. But we're definitely looking into, I guess, self-supervised learning as a way of both like feeding in just neural data by itself and pre-train the model on all that data without having to over-engineer what features we feed it and what outputs we want to get from it, etc. So that's also a critical piece when we're talking about scaling. Yeah.
Cool. You have any thoughts on applying this to non-spiking data? Could that work? How would that work?
I think a similar I'm looking at it from like a similar perspective of unit embeddings. Like the same way we have unit embeddings, we should also have channel embeddings, if you will. And basically the reason why we're trying to like fit all these different kind of like time series, like multivariate time series where the channels are always changing, is kind of the critical thing across all these modalities, whether it's spiking or continuous. And so being able to learn the channel embedding or and being able to like process be able to have a model that can like take in the same way. We're not tokenizing across channels, but we're tokenizing along one channel at a time. I think that's going to be critical. And we have started like testing it on calcium data or calcium traces. we're finding, yeah, that same idea of kind of structuring or representing the data this way of units, time, and then now we would also have a value, is a good way of kind of, yeah, create this unified or universal model. Yeah.
I have a question. First, I want to thank you on the really great presentation. Also awesome work. I think you solve a lot of like difficult problems in one framework, which is put in really neatly. I was just wondering, what are your thoughts of the kind of experiments or kind of data that you're working on? Because we're also still limited by these simple cognitive experiments, which is probably what's underneath. Like the dynamical system is quite simple, it's quite autonomous. But what if we want to move into more complex tasks or trying to model something like decision making? Do you still believe that we could build a foundation on one universal model to decode behavior from it?
I believe so. Yeah, I think what we've been finding is that there is some sort of, even across brain regions, there's something that is kind of universal in the way we process the populations. And so the more data, the goal is to get as much data as possible to be able to do this stuff. And we have work that we're going to present at COSI next week, where we even show that we can transfer from like monkeys to humans when they're doing completely different tasks. And so there does seem to be like this consistent positive transfer across, like, as you said, like different brain regions and all these things. And we're definitely looking at regions other than motor cortex or visual cortex to try to capture more of these more complex tasks. And I think a critical piece to this is going to probably be expanding the context window potentially to more capture the like other scales of dynamics. And I'm hopeful, or at least my philosophy is that the reason why we haven't been able to do it before is because we're trying to decode this very complex thing from a very small amount of data. And if we've learned anything from deep learning, is that data is always king. And so I'm hopeful that by reaching a certain scale, we can potentially, by training on multiple subjects at the same time, training on other unrelated tasks and regions at the same time as well, could potentially help us create a model that would be able to decode more complex things that are happening in the brain. Yeah.
Great.
But obviously self-supervision is going to also be a big part of making that possible, because we don't always have those right labels for more complex tasks, more complex cognitive tasks.
Yeah. Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions for Mehdi? All right, well, thank you so much. This is really amazing to have you presented. I think there's a lot of potential in this. I'll keep looking
you.
out for the newest developments coming out from you. And yeah, I think there's so much potential in like these foundation models across different data sets, different species. It's like really cool what seems possible.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Yeah.
All right, thanks again.
Cool. Thank you. It seems like we're on time, so that's great. Thanks, everyone.
All right, take care.